So let's take it back to the IMF story, where we understand that Ghana can only get a program from the IMF in the first quarter of 2023. So what does that mean for the economy of Ghana? We've been joined on Zoom by economist Dr. Josh Bamfo. Doc, thank you so much for your time and agreeing to speak to us. First of all, what does it mean for Ghana if we are only going to get a support from IMF in the first quarter of 2023?
Thank you very much, KB, for having me. First and foremost, I think it will be highly dependent on the projections that the government has in terms of the use of the funds that they expect to get from this particular program. So if there was an expectation that going to the IMF would lead to them having access to much needed funds immediately, then that could be a concern, because there are two areas that I think there will be the need for help. The first, and I think the most important, is going to be on the balance of payment side of things, where we have excess, import demand compared to export supply. So obviously there's shortage of forex in the forex market. So having that injection of foreign currency, USD, from the IMF was going to be helpful in the short term in terms of shoring up our, CD against the USD on a going forward basis. So if the expectation was to get it immediately, and it's going to take almost, a year to get it, then that could be problematic in terms of the stability of the CD against the USD and other hard currencies. The other aspect would be the budget itself, the budget deficit. We all know that there was some kind of perceived over-reliance on the yield levy helping shore up, our source of revenue in order to meet the, expected expenditures that they were expected to incur during the course of the year. So if part of those funds were to actually help for the shortage or the shortfall of the yield levy generating the much needed revenue in terms of the targets they had, then that could also be a challenge. That means some projects will have to be, delayed till they get access to those funds. So those are the two perspectives that I can perceive potential adverse implications if the projections had anticipated the funds coming in earlier than they thought it would.
So on the impact of the city, how then do we, alleviate or mitigate that impact on the city, which of course is already suffering?
So clearly, access to international markets in terms of, let's say, the Eurobond has always been one of the areas that we shore up the city in the short term. So hopefully, maybe just the announcement of us going to the IMF has already built some level of credibility amongst the investment community in the international market. And if that can help us actually issue some Eurobonds or have access to the international market, then that in the short term can help. But remember, because of the downgrading of our credit rating, the sovereign credit rating is going to come at a relatively higher interest rate than before. And that is what we're trying to avoid. So maybe if we have better credibility in the international market and we have a need, to get in some forex, then the international markets might be one of those options in the interim until the IMF program kicks in sometime next year, first quarter.
If you look at the data, it looks averagely, Ghana goes to the IMF every 5 years. And when we got out of our last one, I spoke to you and you were very convinced that we could do it. What is it that we've gotten wrong? Why do we what do we get wrong such that every 5 or 6 years we need to run back to the IMF for them to save us from crippling our economy?
So clearly, some people have argued that, the IMF is the problem itself. I have always had a different view. The IMF is like an emergency room that you go when you have very significant or serious health problems with the economy. So the IMF never begs to come and help you out. You rather go to the IMF for support. Now, remember that typically IMF will have a short-term, agenda, because you're going to borrow from them. They need to make sure that you are able to actually pay back, even though the interest rates are much lower than what you get from the marketplace. So most of their conditionalities are geared towards cutting down on expenditures and mobilizing more revenue. That in itself is a stabilization mechanism to ensure that your debt situation doesn't get out of hand. But for you to actually have For you to actually have economic growth and make sure that you never go with the IMF, it requires that you have long-term policies that actually generate growth, so that you don't have to go back to the IMF. So those are two different issues. In this particular situation, I think that when we exited from the last situation when we went to the IMF in 2015 and we exited late 2018, 2019, the expectation was that we're going to continue to invest in capital projects that was going to make sure that the economy grows. And as the economy grows, GDP grows up, then we're able to pay back our debt and get to the debt to sustainable levels. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic and currently the Ukraine crisis have actually weakened the foundation of the economy. Hence, we had to go back. So this is slightly different because nobody envisaged these adverse external, impact on the economy. And you can agree with me that almost every global economy is suffering. Even US has not been spared, UK has not been spared. So this has led a bit different reason for going to the IMF.
Interesting. Let's see. So your suggestion to government as to how we can help our economy not to run back to the IMF after this program will be what?
So it's going to be recognizing that, look, our debt is in unsustainable levels. So in spite of the kind of creative ideas that we have as a government to generate high economic growth, which sometimes require investment in capital projects such as infrastructure, development and all that, because our debt is at a very high level, we need to be creative in how we are able to achieve those goals without accumulating so much debt. Or else at some point, we're going to strangle the economy, and the economy will get into some comatose. So I think there should be some creativity along public sector and private sector partnerships in achieving some of these goals. For example, if you're going to have roads, railways, and all that, it cannot be the case that the government fully bears all that cost. Because even when they borrow, they have to pay at some point. And unfortunately, our debt to GDP ratio is around 80%. So we don't have that luxury of government bearing the full cost of some of these capital projects. How can we be creative in bringing the private sector in? And the private sector will have to get their returns in the future so that we don't put all the pressure fully on government purse, which right now is at unsustainable in terms of the debt stock.
Thank you so much. Dr. Josh Banfo is a partner and head of transfer pricing at Anderson in Nigeria and Middle East.